Iran just fired over 3,000 missiles and drones at its Gulf neighbors, Kuwait, Bahrain, the UAE, in a single multi-day assault. And what happened to oil, gold, and the global economy in the 72 hours that followed is something nobody fully predicted. By the end of this video, I'll tell you about one commodity, barely covered by mainstream media, that could trigger the most catastrophic supply shock of the entire crisis. Stay with me. Here's what actually happened, because the scale of this attack is something the headlines have not done justice to. On February 28, 2006, following coordinated US-Israeli strikes on Iran that resulted in the death of Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps launched a multi-day wave of missiles and drones targeting the UAE, Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and Iraq simultaneously. This was not a skirmish. This was a coordinated strategic assault on the entire Gulf Cooperation Council at once. The IRGC confirmed firing 230 drones in a single wave specifically at US troop facilities, hitting Ali Al Salem Air Base and Camp Arifan in Kuwait directly. By March 17th alone, Iran had fired 314 ballistic missiles, 15 cruise missiles, and 1,672 UAVs. At the UAE, Kuwait intercepted 97 ballistic missiles and 283 drones. Bahrain shot down 45 missiles and 9 drones, including Shahed 136 kamikaze variants. Kuwait's international airport was struck by a drone, injuring employees and damaging the passenger terminal. The Ali Al Salem Air Base took direct ballistic missile hits. This was not a warning shot. This was a full-scale campaign. And here is where the air defense story gets deeply uncomfortable. The UAE intercepted 645 drones, impressive on paper, but 35 still made it through, causing material damage across the country. Of 161 ballistic missiles intercepted, 13 fell into the sea uncontrolled. An Iranian drone struck and ignited a fire at the US consulate in Dubai. An Amazon Web Services data center in the UAE was hit and caught fire. And if you think that has no economic consequence, wait until we get to the tech supply chain angle. Kuwait's electricity grid lost 6 power transmission lines after debris from intercepted projectiles fell directly onto them. Ali Bakir, a defense analyst and professor at Qatar University, put it plainly: air defense systems can intercept, but not at scale or at low cost, and saturation attacks remain a serious, unresolved concern. That is the bluntest assessment you will hear from a credentialed expert, and it explains exactly why the financial markets reacted the way they did. Within hours of the first strikes, oil markets did something that hadn't happened in 4 years. Brent crude was sitting at $71.32 per barrel on February 27th, a relatively calm number. By March 2nd, it had jumped 8%, clearing $77. That was just the opening move. By March 9th, as the Strait of Hormuz physically shut down and Gulf storage terminals began filling to capacity, Brent crossed $100 per barrel for the first time since 2022. Then it kept climbing. By mid-March, Brent was trading near $120 per barrel, approaching the all-time high of 147 set in July 2008. The International Energy Agency estimated crude production cuts of at least 8 million barrels per day, with a further 2 million barrels per day of condensates shut in across Iraq, Kuwait, the UAE, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia. To contextualize that number, a complete halt of Gulf oil exports would remove roughly 20% of total global oil supply, and 80% of that supply normally flows east to Asia. The continent most exposed to this crisis isn't Europe, it's Asia, and that changes the geopolitical calculus entirely. But the oil price spike was only possible because of what happened at the Strait of Hormuz, the single most consequential waterway on Earth. UK maritime trade operations confirmed that vessels in the Gulf received formal notification of strait closure. A container ship was struck and set ablaze in the strait itself, 25 nautical miles northwest of Ras Al Khaimah, confirmed by UK MTO. This is not a drill, not a threat, not a bluff. In all of modern history, through the 1973 oil embargo, the 1980 Iran-Iraq tanker war, the 1990 Gulf War, the Strait of Hormuz was threatened, warned about, and priced into markets. It was never actually closed. This is the first time in recorded history that the strait physically shut down. There is no precedent for this. Every financial model, every emergency reserve calculation, every IEA scenario, they were all built on the assumption that the strait stays open. That assumption is now gone. Iran didn't just target ships. It targeted the infrastructure that keeps the global energy system alive. Bahrain's state-owned Bapco refinery declared force majeure after Iranian strikes hit its complex directly. Saudi Arabia intercepted 4 drones heading for the Sheba oil field, one of the kingdom's most critical production facilities. The UAE, Qatar, and Kuwait all reported active missile attacks on energy infrastructure in the same window. ADNOC CEO Sultan Al Jaber publicly called it global economic warfare, not a geopolitical dispute, not a regional conflict. Economic warfare. Iraq and Kuwait were the first producers to cut output, as Gulf storage filled with crude that had nowhere to go. Reuters sources inside Gulf state oil companies confirmed the UAE was likely to follow within days. The world's spare production capacity was not just threatened, it was being physically neutralized in real time. If oil was the headline, natural gas was the quiet catastrophe that Europe wasn't ready for. Asian natural gas prices rose 54% in the single week following February 28th. European gas prices rose 63% in the same window. Qatar Energy, the world's largest LNG exporter, declared force majeure on all exports following the Strait closure. Around 110 billion cubic meters per year of LNG, representing 19% of global LNG trade, was disrupted from day one. The critical detail here is that the global LNG market was already running at maximum utilization. There is no spare capacity, no backup supplier that can simply flip a switch. And sitting in the background, watching every one of these numbers tick up, is Russia. China may now fast-track negotiations on the Power of Siberia 2 pipeline as a direct insurance policy against prolonged Gulf disruption. Moscow did not fire a single missile in this conflict, and it may end up as one of the largest beneficiaries. Meanwhile, in the equity and precious metals markets, the reaction was immediate and telling. Gold was already elevated heading into late February, and on the day the escalation began, it rose another 2.3%, trading near $5,246 per ounce by March 1st, a level that reflects pure fear premium. The Dow Jones Industrial Average fell over 400 points. The S&P 500 dropped 0.7% in a single session on March 2nd. JP Morgan issued a warning that if Brent remains elevated through mid-2006, global GDP growth in the first half of the year could be depressed by 0.6% annualized, with global consumer prices rising more than 1%. That is not a small number. That is a coordinated global recession signal from the largest investment bank on the planet. And then there is the insider trading story that a Financial Times investigation uncovered. $580 million in bets placed on falling oil prices, executed just 15 minutes before Donald Trump published a statement on March 23rd, announcing a pause in operations for diplomatic talks. 15 minutes. That timing is not a coincidence, and regulators have not closed the book on it. Here's the part of this story that mainstream financial media has almost completely ignored. Gulf countries supply roughly 45% of global sulfur, a byproduct of oil and gas processing that is the foundation of the global fertilizer industry, and a critical input for copper leaching and sulfuric acid manufacturing. With tanker traffic near zero, that sulfur is not moving. Fertilizer costs are about to spike in ways that grain markets have not yet priced in. There is also a helium problem. The Gulf accounts for a significant share of global helium production, and helium is not optional for semiconductor fabrication. The chip industry that survived the 2021 shortage, the pandemic disruptions, and the Taiwan risk scenarios is now facing a Gulf helium supply crunch. On top of that, LPG and naphtha flows from the region have collapsed, forcing petrochemical plants globally to cut polymer production, meaning plastic input costs are rising alongside everything else. This is a cascading industrial shock, not just an energy price event. And fertilizer markets, the ones that feed billions of people, have barely started reacting. Every major crisis in the Persian Gulf over the last 50 years followed a similar pattern: fear, price spike, resolution. The Yom Kippur oil embargo in 1973, the Iranian Revolution in 1979, the tanker war of the 1980s, the Gulf War in 1990. In every single case, the Strait of Hormuz was threatened, markets priced in the risk, and then the physical flow of oil continued. When Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, Brent spiked to $139 per barrel, but the world rerouted. Indian refiners bought discounted Russian crude. Europe pivoted to US LNG. The system bent, but it didn't break, because there were alternative paths. The 2026 crisis is structurally different. The Strait of Hormuz cannot be rerouted. There is no alternative waterway that handles 20 million barrels of oil per day. The IEA has called this the greatest global energy security challenge in history, and that phrasing is not hyperbole. It is a clinical assessment from the institution that exists specifically to prevent this scenario. So, what are analysts actually watching right now as signals for where this goes next? JP Morgan has published projections showing regional production shut-ins reaching 12 million barrels per day if the strait remains closed past March 22nd, and potentially 16 million barrels per day if Iran's Karg Island terminal, which handles 90% of Iran's own crude exports, gets drawn into the conflict. On the defense side, Ryan Bohl of the RAIN network stated plainly that if Iranian attacks continue, Gulf Arab states will eventually transition from defense to active counterstrikes on Iranian territory. That escalation path has its own oil price implications that nobody has fully modeled. IEA member countries agreed on March 11th to release 400 million barrels from emergency reserves, a significant coordinated move that, under normal circumstances, would calm markets instantly. Against a potential 16 million barrel per day gap, 400 million barrels buys approximately 25 days. That is the math. 25 days of buffer against a conflict with no visible off-ramp. The Strait of Hormuz has been threatened dozens of times across 5 decades of geopolitical tension. It has never actually closed. Until now, emergency reserves are limited. LNG has no spare capacity. Fertilizer markets are a week behind. And somewhere in a regulatory office, investigators are still looking at $580 million in suspiciously timed oil bets. So here's the real question, and drop your answer in the comments, because I genuinely want to know what you think. If this conflict runs another 30 days without a diplomatic resolution, which economy breaks first?